Good afternoon, Barry.
Hi, John.
Hey, I'm wearing my chartreuse, really bright jacket, in part because it's cold down here in my basement, but also I'm also kind of in mourning. I'm in shock. Last week was a really bad week for fiscal sanity.
Well, I think Donald Trump says that debt doesn't matter, and that's certainly been on display this week.
Yeah, the parochialism is still trumping, no pun intended, fiscal sanity, because we have representatives in the tightly contested House of Representatives insisting on tax cuts for the rich, quadrupling the SALT limitation. Sorry for the acronym for our listeners, the state and local tax deduction on federal taxes. Yeah, they quadrupled that, and that's clearly a tax cut for the rich. There's no dispute about that. There's no growth benefit to it that can be argued with, like some of the other things that some have argued are tax cuts for the rich. It's really sad. And Ron Johnson had a great op-ed in the Wall Street Journal where he concluded where you and I have been for a long time, namely our toes are tickling the edge of the fiscal cliff. But notably in that article where Senator Johnson makes a lot of good points, he still does not touch any specific spending cut. And we've been telling our listeners in our various podcasts, our videos, that that's one of the reasons that they need to support a research institute. I would argue ours, the Institute for Objective Policy Assessment, policytalk.org, because the others are dropping the ball. They're not doing anything. They need to support our efforts to set the table for a plunge off the edge of the fiscal cliff. We need to vet and plan out tax cuts, something that Congress will not even discuss, much less get right in a frenzied atmosphere, so that these ideas are on the table when they finally do have to cut, hopefully to avoid printing money like crazy to keep up with the debt finance, which, I'm rambling a little bit today, Barry. I apologize, but the listeners out there, at what point will you be alarmed by how much of our revenue we're spending just on interest? We're sneaking up on a third. At 5% interest, we're going to be spending a third of our $5 trillion roughly annual federal revenue just paying interest on our debt. It's looking ugly, and last week it looked especially ugly because any two or three representatives can insist on something to keep that big, beautiful, in some aspects, but ugly in other aspects, bill from passing the House of Representatives. And it's almost as tight in the Senate with 53 to 47, where a couple of senators can hold up progress on what several senators have said is a dire fiscal situation. And we miss Senator Braun, who's now governor of Indiana. He was a leading spokesperson in the Senate for fiscal sanity, and maybe he got frustrated and decided his abilities were better used in the State House in Indiana.
Well, he certainly was one of the few people concerned about the debt. Of course, the Congressional Budget Office came out with the shocker that the big, beautiful bill is going to add trillions more to the public debt. President Trump doesn't seem to be fazed by that. He's still talking about being a loving debt and so forth. And what's shocking to me is that not only are they failing to address the current problems in spending and that's contributing to the debt, they're proposing even more debt. And the shocker to me was this last week Trump proposed the Golden Dome Project. Well, the Golden Dome Project, of course, is the U.S. equivalent of the Iron Dome that Israel is using for national defense. Well, Trump says this project will cost $175 billion. There are estimates that project alone could increase the debt by $1.5 trillion over the next decade. And it's just shocking that there is no perception that this is a crisis, or that we can simply add more projects like this that are simply going to be paid for with more debt. And of course, the problem with a project like that is you have to ask, what does it accomplish? Because the idea that we can create this dome that will protect the U.S. From Chinese missiles, first of all, the technology is unknown. The best estimates are the new technology for this project won't be available till the mid-1930s. Well, President Trump says he's going to have this up and going by the end of his term. Well, so it's sort of like, there's a fantasy world out there. And of course, the real problem with a project like that is China, of course, will respond with its own weapon systems and so forth. So we're really starting a new arms race. Well, that's the last thing that we can afford at this point with the debt we already have. There's no way that we can afford another $1.5 trillion for a project that may or may not be successful. So, as you say, it's very frustrating to watch this happen.
Yeah, last week and the last few years. I go back to something that I said before, that John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist, was a lousy political scientist. His good idea about a cyclically balanced budget is one of the main things that has triggered the end of budgeting. I mean, there are no budgets anymore. They're just spending plans. And every time there's an increase in spending for whatever good reason, like COVID or a defense emergency, it becomes the new floor for additional spending. There's never any cutback in the overall level of spending, much less specific spending cuts. And yeah, we are at the edge of that fiscal cliff. And as another prominent spokesperson, well, two other prominent spokespersons have been in the news here in early June 2025. For those of you who may be watching this later on, Jamie Dimon, he's said, I don't know whether it's going to be 6 years or 6 months before this crashes. None of us knows that for sure. None of us can get in the heads of all the people in the bond market that are going to decide at what point this becomes a crazy thing. And for you listeners out there that are wondering, how do I defend myself? Buy gold, that's a traditional thing. But if we go into printing mass money to fund the debt and the interest payments, the supply chains are going to break down. And I don't know any defense against that other than stockpiling food and fuel. Having gold, you can't eat that. You can't heat your home with it. Again, looking back at the hyperinflation of the 20s, the supply chains in Germany and other places where it happened crashed. Again, you can't defend yourself against that other than becoming self-sufficient and not relying on trade to meet your needs.
Well, you and I are looking at this from an economist perspective, and of course, there are pretty disastrous outcomes if we encounter this debt crisis and suddenly people are unwilling to purchase U.S. debt. The interest rate, of course, will go skyrocketing. I'll tell you another thing that I'm increasingly worried about, John, and that is we need to also look at the military implications of this, because if the U.S. builds something like this Golden Dome project and the Chinese retaliate or respond in kind, both countries are pursuing a path of unsustained growth and debt. And of course, we think about the economic outcome, but there is a military outcome. Some people would argue that if you create a defense system like Golden Dome, it actually increases the risk of a nuclear conflict, because the idea is, well, if we have this effective dome that's going to protect us, why not a first strike? And the Chinese asking the same question, why not a first strike? Because and if you're running into a debt crisis, that could trigger this. So, I think we need to look at this both in terms of its military as well as economic implications. You and I aren't experts on the military issues, but nonetheless, it's something that is becoming more and more imperative.
Well, we've recorded some videos on the national defense implications and might just repeat those. We don't have any fiscal space to ramp up a defense response to a concurrent emergency that we can't anticipate. We need to get back. We need our federal government back to its first principles, to what's in the Constitution, so that we can finance defense. And we're not making an argument right now for smaller government per se. We're just saying a lot of stuff that belongs to the states, according to the Constitution, needs to go back there, because we can't afford the federal government we have, and its first responsibility is to protect us. And we are unable to do that at the moment because we're borrowed up to the hilt already, and a rapid defense response requires some borrowing. We're endangering our lives, as you say, by doing too much and too much of the wrong things on the defense side, but we're not even able at the moment, as many people from the Pentagon and the military have publicly stated, we are not able to, because of our debt, to ramp up our defense response quickly. And many of our arms stockpiles are at dangerously low levels already.
Yeah, and I think if you look back at the Reagan administration pursued Star Wars, and of course it failed. They never did solve the technological problems to make it a viable defense system. But at that point, we had a very modest level of debt relative to GDP. And so the debt issue, the debt outcomes of that spending were not that critical. But at this point in time, if we launch a similar project that could cost $1.5 trillion, suddenly the debt becomes a constraint here in a way that it didn't back during the Reagan years.
Yes, there are fundamental differences between the current situation and those situations in the past where we've thought that a increase in defense spending was needed. And, we talk about our struggles in that area. We can't afford to support allies who need our support. We can argue about Ukraine and all of that. We're borderline broke. We can't afford some of our own spending. We can't afford the federal government we have. And maybe back to the beginning of our conversation, there are not enough people, at least when they're electioneering, admitting that they've got to protect their parochial interests. They've got to protect the wealthy people in their district. I mean, the SALT limitation, quadrupling that. A few representatives that are Republican from New York and Illinois and California have said, hey, we're not going to let this bill pass unless you restore the SALT limitation to tax deduction. Youch, we've got a lot of that going on. And it's hard to be optimistic. But again, I would urge the listeners to consider supporting IOPA's efforts to set the table for when Congress does have to behave in a serious way because the bond buyers are balking at buying our debt, or because the interest rate's getting too high and we can no longer afford it. We need to figure out which taxes can be raised, because Congress is going to raise some under those circumstances. I know neither of us favor tax hikes, but it's probably going to happen. And we better raise the right ones that actually produce the revenue when we do that. We've got to plan and vet some spending cuts, because the Congress can't have those kinds of discussions, because it gets into the news and they're depicted as being against somebody, and the savings from the programs, each individual program, is never enough to get any voters excited about the benefits of the cuts. So we need a research institute. I would argue ours is the only one ready to do it, but we need somebody outside the government to take on a lot of these tasks, and we're ready to do it. And we need your support out there. And Barry, I think that's a good place to end it, unless you want to have the final word on it. And we'll.
No, I think we've given them enough of the dismal science, so let's sign off.
Have a good weekend.
Yeah, right.
In the short term, we can enjoy the great June weather we're having, but the near-term outlook does not look great.